All right. Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and ISU Extension and Outreach. I want to acknowledge the key partners that make the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation webinar series possible. In addition to Iowa State University, we have the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa Department of Natural Resources, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So I'm really excited to get to introduce our speaker for today, Kevin Kuehner, with a hydrologist with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I was thinking as I was getting ready for this that I think Kevin and I have known each other for almost going on 2 decades, and have always admired the work that he's been able to do in Minnesota. And I saw him talk about this topic at the Tri-Society meeting back in November and thought it was a great topic for our conservation webinar. So as always, if you have questions or comments, please type those in the chat box and then I'll make sure I can get those to Kevin at the end of his talk. With that, Kevin, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the great introduction. And yeah, thanks for the invitation. Great to be here. And hats off to the organizers of these webinars with the ILF group. So the focus of my talk today is focused on groundwater and specifically sharing some results from a research and study that we did over the last several years, looking at this question of the age of groundwater and how to use that information to better interpret nitrate trends that we're seeing in areas, springs, streams, and wells in southeast Minnesota. So the focus of the study area is in this kind of general large area, what we call the driftless area. This is an area that covers over 15 million acres, encompassing 4 different states. This is a unique area in that it was not covered by the most recent glacial advance. So as a result of that, we get some very diverse, both agricultural and geological processes here in this area. Deeply incised valleys, rugged bluffs, cold water trout streams, sinkhole plains, and just a unique part of the Midwest. The study areas I'm going to kind of really focus in on in terms of the data is going to be in southeast corner of Minnesota, but I'm also going to be referencing some data that we used in the northeast Iowa on some stream data, and also some stream data and trend data that we looked at in the glacial till region, just to the west of the driftless area. This driftless area is considered to be karst, and really what karst is it's a landscape with distinct hydrology and landforms that occurs when that underlying rock is soluble. In this case, it's primarily limestone made of calcium carbonate that dissolves slowly over time with slightly acidic rainwater and soil water over thousands to millions of years. And it creates these features on the landscape, such as sinkholes, caves, and springs. And this is also this network of underground, plumbing essentially creates this, mix of groundwater that comes out as springs and feeds our streams and provides really these high quality trout streams. And it's because of this, constant supply of cold water. Karst is not unique to the driftless area. The USGS estimates that about 20% of the land area across the continental United States is considered karst. But not all karst is the same, and it really kind of depends on how much soil cover is over that karst landscape. Because you'll notice most of Iowa and most of southeast Minnesota and southern Wisconsin is considered karst. But if you start looking at the details here, especially for southeast Minnesota, we have what's called covered karst and we have active karst. And it's that active karst where we have less than typically 50 feet of soil cover over that fractured bedrock that's can cause some concerns, obviously, from a water quality standpoint. And this can create an increased risk for contaminants to groundwater and surface water. One of the most, one of the most commonly detected contaminants in groundwater especially in Minnesota, is nitrate, both in surface water and in groundwater. And these are results from nitrate testing that took place between 2013 and 19, covering over 32,000 different wells. It was primarily targeting areas in the state that had significant row cropping and were also geologically vulnerable. And across the state, we see that about 9% of the wells are testing above the drinking health standard of drinking water health standard of 10 milligrams per liter. When we look at southeast Minnesota, that driftless area, we see it closer to about 14% of the wells are testing above 10 milligrams per liter. In 2019, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture adopted a rule called the Minnesota's Groundwater Protection Rule. And part of this is to basically help try to reduce as much of that nitrate as possible in these agricultural settings in surface water and groundwater. And a part of that, there's kind of a combination of both regulatory and voluntary efforts to reduce nitrates. And there's potential regulations, especially for municipalities. In the rule, it does reference BMP adoption rates and nitrate trends as kind of triggers for whether there might be a potential regulation or taking out regulation if depending on those two metrics. And in the rule, it does cite this idea of lag time, and knowing that there is sort of a delay between when practices are put on the land and when that might show up in the groundwater. In addition to that, we have Minnesota has what's called the Clean Water Fund, which was passed in 2009, and that provides a lot of financial and technical support to help farmers and landowners adopt some of these practices that reduce nitrate. But there's a lot of questions surrounding that. Number one is just, are the nitrates improving, or are they getting worse, and where is that happening? Not just in drinking water wells, but also across the entire groundwater system, including springs and streams. It's one thing to do the trend. It's another thing is, how do we actually interpret that data, especially within the context of the complex hydrogeology that we have here in the Southeast. And then ultimately, all these kind of questions sort of revolve around, how soon, can we see improvements, which is something I think we're all very interested in wondering how long that may take. And to get at these questions, although they're very basic questions, it does really take very much a team effort and a multidisciplinary approach to get at some of these challenging questions. I was really fortunate, to be able to partner and collaborate with Dr. Tony Runkle with the Minnesota Geological Survey and John Barry. And we put together a paper that was published here last year that really focuses on trying to address some of those questions. There's a lot of other people in the background and other programs that helped fund and helped provide support for this. And I have kind of a list here to acknowledge their contributions to that effort. All right, so let's get into the trend data. So this is a lot of data showing up in this simple bar chart, but it represents about 35,000 individual nitrate samples across 1,200 sites. We considered significance when the p-value is less than 0.05. Primarily reflects years 2000 through 2021, and mainly within the driftless area of southeast Minnesota. But it does also include, in terms of stream trends, where we're able to leverage some data from the Northeast Iowa RC&D, where they've got a great monitoring program going on there in the Upper Iowa River watershed. So we're able to analyze some of that data as well. So I'm going to first kind of just focus on the well data, just to make it a little bit easier to focus on this. But for the well data, we find that majority of the sites that we had data for, that we had enough data to run trend analysis on, we found that 34% of those were below detection, and about 50% or close to it were at no trend. We did find about 13% of the wells were trending upward, and we found that 4% were decreasing. When we switch over to streams and springs, we see a much different story there. And we see that the dominant trend in those particular sites and settings were an increasing trend. So over 50% of those sites were showing an increasing trend in nitrate. So the question is, how do we interpret this? And what sort of sense can we make out of it? So I'm going to start with the spring data first. And what's interesting with that is what we find is that the nitrate concentrations and the trend patterns are not solely explained by the current land use, which creates challenges, right, in terms of interpreting. Now, I'll kind of explain that here with this data here, where when we plot the mean nitrate concentrations of these wells over these particular springs, over the last 20 years, and we plot that against the percent row cropping, we find that there's a pretty good relationship there, but not great. We see that about 50% of the spring nitrate concentrations can be explained by the percent row cropping, in this case, percentage of corn and soybean production. There's a lot of variability and a lot of scatter, though, in the data. And kind of a good example here is if we look at these 4 particular springs, they all kind of share a similar percentage of row cropping, around 57%. But we have markedly different nitrate concentrations that range from around 5 upwards to nearly 15 milligrams per liter. So the question is, what's causing that? And so it's been theorized that we're getting some variable mixing of both local and regional groundwater is probably a key factor. So in other words, it's probably a mixing of both older and younger water, in this system. The problem, though, is that we just have a very poor understanding of the age of that water in these systems, especially these complex karst systems. And so we just don't know, very much about that. And so it really comes to this question of the age of the water or the residence time of that water. And to kind of give you some perspective on where we were at about 20 years ago on this, this is one of our kind of long-term spring monitoring sites that we have. And this is water coming out of the Prairie du Chien and Jordan aquifers. It's located in Beaver Creek Valley State Park in Houston County. And about 20 years ago, the park had put up a sign or a plaque on a rock, and it basically was trying to talk about or explain the interesting facts about groundwater, and specifically in this case, wondering where this water is coming from and where it's how long has it been in the ground. And then the plaque kind of goes on to say that they estimated that the water coming from Big Spring has not been in the ground for a very long time. And probably they were estimating that probably not more than maybe a year that water was in the system. So again, this is where we're at about 20 years ago in terms of our understanding of this. But based on our new data that we have now, I'll come back to this at the very end, and we'll kind of take a closer look at this. So if we look at the nitrate trend data for Big Spring, this is what we found since about 2006. And it's very clear that we have an increasing trend at this site. And it's increasing at a rate of about 3.5% per year, which equates to about 0.2 milligrams per liter. So based on this current rate and kind of where we're currently at, it's probably within about 10 or 15 years that we're going to start to exceed that drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter at this particular spring. Now we contrast that to a different spring that's in a different geological setting. And this is in Fillmore County. This is called Fountain West Spring. And this is what we call basically a superficial aquifer spring or a water table spring. So it's closer near to the surface. And what we see here is a lot of scatter in the data, and we see a lot of ups and downs in the data. But statistically, there's really no trend from that type of data set. So to understand a little bit in terms of how to try to interpret that, we have to look at the geology. And so if we looked at a cross-section of southeast Minnesota, this would also apply to northeast Iowa, is kind of from west to east, these are the different rock layers that we have. So east being closer to the Mississippi, west being in those more western counties of Mower and western Fillmore County. And what we have here is we have these stacked layers of rock resulting in multiple aquifers. And what you're seeing as aquifers are showing up as white. And these aquifers consist of high permeability sandstone and carbonate rock. And one of the most commonly used aquifers in this region is the Prairie du Chien Jordan aquifer. Now, also what you'll see here is these kind of brown colored layers would represent the aquitards, or these are the confining layers within these different geological units. And these aquatards have a very low permeability, and so they restrict or reduce the downward movement of groundwater. And all of these aquatards are variably leaky. But what's really important to understand about these aquatards is this is what really kind of results in this pronounced stratification of the detections of contaminants that we find, and also the age of the water. And so kind of just drawing some very simple arrows here in terms of the general pathway of how groundwater moves is that in these superficial aquifers, we tend to find, pretty quick movements to let's say, water resources like Fountain West Spring. Whereas when we get into Big Spring, that water is coming from a much larger area. And it's also had to go through a lot of different layers to get to Big Spring. So the residence time or the age of that water can be markedly different in those types of systems. We also know as we get deeper down into these different geological layers that water is under pressure, and we can actually have it kind of like an artesian effect, that water move upward. In all these locations, we can get mixing, which makes it even more confounding and more complicated. But ultimately, this also changes across the landscape from west to east. And you'll notice that some of these areas, for instance, in Area 2, the Decorah Cummingsville aquitard is present, but you'll notice in Area 3, it's no longer present since it's been eroded away, through geologic time. So you have to kind of keep that in mind too, in terms of kind of looking at this in these multiple dimensions. So to kind of help convey some of this, several years ago, we created some videos that help kind of convey or help explain this a little bit easier, and through animation. And the idea is if we can understand how groundwater moves in each of these kind of different areas, we can then better understand how contaminants like nitrate move in these systems. And in the videos, we highlight this idea that this water has different travel times once it gets into that bedrock and through the soil and into the bedrock. Some of it can move, miles per day, as what we find maybe in conduits. We can find some of this water that moves maybe feet per day in the fractures, which again, from a groundwater perspective, is sort of jet speed, when it comes to groundwater movement. But we also have a lot of that water when that rock is fully saturated, a lot of that rock is tied up in the pore spaces or the matrix of the rock itself. And that's where the dominant amount of our water is stored within our aquifers. And that's important to understand when trying to understand the age of the water and the movement of contaminants. And then, so this really introduces this concept of residence time. And residence time is often referred to as travel time or lag time or age. But essentially, it's basically the amount of time it takes for water to move from the land surface to the point of measurement, whether it be a spring, a well, a stream, or even a tile, within a field. In this particular case, we're kind of demonstrating a drinking water well and kind of the pathway that water may take. And it's important to also notice that there's going to be differences, of course, between how water moves to a well versus a spring. And generally speaking, we find much more narrower, longer travel times for wells versus springs, which could be much more variable. And the reason for that, of course, is we intentionally design, when we construct new wells, to have casing and grout to try to minimize that younger water component that may be coming to that well. And of course, the screening interval and other variables are key factors as well in terms of determining that age or the residence time. But essentially, what this kind of all means is that, that single groundwater sample that we may collect, whether it be from a spring, a well, or a stream, it really represents kind of a multiple different flow paths that are working at traveling at different speeds. So how do we measure residence time? So there's a variety of tools that can be used. For kind of that water that may move pretty quickly, kind of the tried and true method is dye tracing. And that may give us a sense of, that hours to months type kind of time scale. When we look at that older water component that might be years to decades old, the kind of standard methodology there is to use atmospheric tracers, and the U.S. Geological Survey has kind of developed the methodology for that and has used that quite extensively across the United States. And kind of the main tracers that they use are tritium, chlorofluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. And the idea there is these are basically human, these are basically derived from our activities, tritium, for instance, from nuclear testing in the 1950s. And so based on those concentrations, once they get in the atmosphere, they get into the water cycle, they can estimate the age of that water. There's another method using carbon-14, for some of that really old water that might be centuries to thousands of years old. But kind of the point is with all these, they all have their limitations. Some of them may be related to cost. Some of these could be, thousands of dollars per sample. But ultimately, you really do need kind of multiple independent lines of evidence to improve your confidence in these results. One thing that we've been kind of working on for probably the last 5 to 10 years is this idea of, could we use existing data sets to kind of add to this pool of knowledge, and in terms of using a discontinued herbicide product as a chemical age tracer. And I'm just going to show you some concentration data that we have from 4 different springs. And this is really kind of what keyed me in on maybe potentially using this as an age tracer. And this is a chemical that we have in our typical suite of pesticides that we monitor in these springs, which is called allichlor. And it's a degradate of allichlor, which is ESA. And you'll notice some really interesting patterns in the data where we have decreasing, we have linear increasing, we have some sort of exponential types of decreasing, and we also have ones that appear to be at or near peak. And what's really interesting about these data is that we have not used allichlor for over 25 years. So this gives us a sense that this water is especially in these particular sites, Highway 76 and Big Spring and Peterson, that water is definitely much older than a few years, and it's much older than that. So a little background on allichlor. So allichlor, it was a commonly used herbicide in the 1970s to the 1990s. The trade name was Lasso. And if you were farming during that time period, it's probably very likely that you're using this herbicide because there just wasn't very many products out there. What's interesting though about allichlor is that its use fell dramatically in the 1990s, and then by about 2000, it completely there was no longer any use of it, mainly because there was concerns about it in groundwater, and also there are just better chemistries that were out there that came about. So it kind of makes an ideal tracer in that we can, we have kind of a defined start, peak, and end use patterns of the usage of allichlor in the state. And it does remain conservative once it gets in groundwater. And then, but one of the limitations is, though, it really only reflects that kind of post-1970s component of the mixture of the water. But the basic method was to basically look at the difference in years between the corresponding trend regressions between the allichlor usage and the patterns that we're seeing in the groundwater, and looking at those differences and sort of mathematically or statistically determining, what the difference is between those two regression lines, and estimating then and inferring that as being the estimated age. And it really depended on whether it was linear or nonlinear, and we used kind of different methods for that. So we applied all that information using this allichlor method. We applied it to sites where we had enough data, both time series data for allichlor, also where we had enough data to run nitrate trend analysis on. And we also combined that with, at the same time, with some work that USGS was doing for us to use the atmospheric tracer method. We also had some additional data from the University of Minnesota that had done some work back in 2018 using carbon-14. And we did kind of a reanalysis of that data on some of these sites that we were working with. So I'm going to start with the spring data first. So we have 13 springs where we applied this allichlor method to age the water, and also do the nitrate trends on. And we can kind of group these springs into 3 different groups A, B, and C. The A being the shallow springs, the B kind of more mixed, and the group C springs kind of deeper in the geologic profile. And so this is the allichlor data, the allichlor ESA data. And it's what you're seeing here is basically the concentrations in parts per trillion. And it's what you're seeing is the interquartile range, and then the kind of solid black line is the median. Also included on there, you'll see the arrows representing the trend, and then the percentages expressing that as a percent annual change of that trend in the concentration. And this is kind of typically what you see, right? It just seems like this big scatter, and it's really difficult to kind of discern what's going on with the data. But when we can sort the data by the hydrostratigraphic position, or where it's kind of sitting in reference to those different geologic layers, it starts to make more sense. So when we kind of organize them from more shallow to deep, this is what we get. So what we see here is on all these shallow springs, we see a lot of decreasing allichlor concentrations, which makes a lot of sense since we stopped using it back in the late 90s. But what's interesting is we do see a lot of these sites that have these deeper sites that are lower in the profile, they are all increasing. And so based on that relationship and comparing that to the allichlor usage across the state, we can then estimate the age of that water. And so what our results showed was that the ages range from about 1 to 4 decades across these 13 different springs. And of course, the youngest water appeared in the shallow springs, which made a lot of sense. And the older water showed up more in those deeper springs. And just for reference, Fountain West ended up being about 12 years in age, and Big Spring was estimated at a little over 30 years. We also found a very positive relationship between the depth of these springs, the relative depth of these springs, and the residence time. And for about every 100 feet, we're gaining an age of about 10 years. So we have that data. We can now start to layer in the nitrate data. And what we find for the nitrate concentrations is they're highest in those springs, and also a lot more variable, though. In the deeper springs, the nitrates were lower and much less variability. When we layer in the nitrate trend data, this is where it gets interesting, is where we see in these shallow springs, we see typically no trend. And then in these deeper springs, we see a pretty consistent pattern of all increasing trends for nitrate in those deeper settings. We did have one site that was decreasing. And again, for reference, Fountain West and Big Spring. The nitrate, we did see a relationship too with depth, in that nitrates went down by about 3 milligrams per liter for about every 100 feet of depth. Now, when we combine all this data together, not only the allichlor method, but also the USGS atmospheric tracer method, and where we have trend data, we find that there is a relationship there also with as residence time increases, the nitrate trends also increase. And this is especially the case in this area 3, or what we call the Prairie du Chien Plateau. And when we combine all the data where we don't necessarily have trend data, but we just have age data, this is both the allichlor method and the USGS method, we find that the mean age is 34 years across 40 different sites. This includes both wells and springs. And we also, as I mentioned, we also know that there's certain wells that do not have any detectable nitrate. And so we took a closer look at that, and specifically looking at the carbon-14 data. And we find in that case, we find that the mean age on those sites where we had carbon-14 data, the mean age was over 7,000 years old on those sites that do not have detectable nitrate. So if indeed, we have this water that is, decadal type ages, we then have to kind of look back in history to help us better interpret these trends. And if we go back and kind of reconstruct the amount of corn and soybean acre production over the years in southeast Minnesota, this is kind of what we come up with. And we basically have about 2 times more corn and soybean acre production than we did, let's say, in the 1940s or 1950s. We do see the hay, alfalfa, and the perennials have gone down as a result of that offset. And then we can also look at the CRP acres, which have been kind of holding steady here lately. And then we can also look at the historical in terms of the fertilizer sales across the state. And we see a lot of those changes, of course, were occurring after World War II, especially in the 1960s. For soybeans, we saw a spike there in the 1980s. And again, we see this continued decline of perennials. Now for that younger water fraction, we kind of have to think about the impact of precipitation and how that may impact these data as well. Now I'll kind of move on here for the stream data, and this kind of helps kind of explain that a little bit better. But just looking at the Karst stream data, it makes sense that, if we have increasing trends for springs, it's likely to manifest into our streams. And that's exactly what we find. But when we work outside of this area, outside the karst area, and we look at more of our tile drain systems, we find a much different story. We find that during this trend period, we find the biggest dominant trend is decreasing trends. And especially if we look at the most recent 10 years of this study, where we see the vast majority of those sites, over 80% of those tile drain watersheds that have basically very young water, we were showing decreasing trends. So the question is, what was causing that? And we concluded that the most likely explanation and the dominant explanation is just how wet it has been, especially during the study period, and especially that period between 2016 and 2020, where 5 of the 12 wettest years occurred consecutively between those particular years, and that's kind of the period where we were setting quite a few records with regard to precipitation across southern Minnesota. And this is just showing it, sort of graphically and in a map sort of version. But kind of the thing I want to kind of point out here is that despite, this really wet period, regardless of the precipitation, we still did see increasing trends in this area 3, which again highlights this influence of this older groundwater. So with all this information, we can kind of put together this conceptual model of the age of the water. We can also layer in the nitrate concentrations, and the nitrates are sort of kind of reverse of the age of the water, where we get more the higher concentration nitrate in this younger water. And we can also then start to make some interpretations of, what factors you need to think about if you're sampling water above the black line or below the black line. If you're above, you got to think about precipitation, land use, and recent and management practices. But if you're below, it gets much more complicated because of dilution from that older water and also legacy inputs, both in land use and nitrogen. And it also helps kind of explain why we can have 2 wells right next to each other and have markedly different chemistry and trends that might be happening. And again, that area 3 showing where we have this higher risk of increasing trends, likely because of kind of this leaky aquitard that we have in this area. So in summary, the younger groundwater mixtures were less than 20 years old. They typically had elevated nitrate, but the trends are relatively stable, or in some cases declining. But trying to decipher or separate out the effect of the decreasing trends is complicated because of the variability caused by that increased precipitation that we had. And many of those older groundwater sites that were typically older than 30 years, it typically has lower nitrate, but the levels are slowly increasing in some of these sites, and especially in many springs and streams in that area 3. And this trend will continue until sort of a steady state or equilibrium is reached between historical and land use practices. And significant reductions in nitrogen inputs will take time to measure that, and it will take decades to observe that. And this will be applied to many of the commonly used aquifers that we have in southeast Minnesota. But despite all those challenges, it's really important to recognize that anything we can do to reduce nitrogen inputs is really important, and it will affect our future nitrate. But in the near term, we'll have to be thinking about other ways to gauge success. And to kind of wrap it up here, going back to Big Spring, if we would have to make a slight edit or revision to that, is that the water coming from Big Spring is a mixture of water that likely infiltrated the land surface over 3 decades ago. So thank you, Matt, and I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Kevin. That was fabulous. Okay, let's move, get through these logistical slides, and then we got some questions, and keep them coming in. But if you watch this webinar live and are wanting to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW @iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. Let's go to the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response is needed for all 2026 webinars. So if you've done it for the first few in January, thank you so very much. If you're willing to do it, we would greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code. If I talk long enough, you can get your phone up there. Otherwise, you can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Let's maybe plug I think the next, okay, we got Brady Clausen going to talk about circular bioeconomy strategies for enhancing soil plant health. So something a little bit different, but please tune in next week to hear Brady's presentation. And is there a next slide? If you watch this webinar live, for today's, all the webinars are archived, excuse me. You can go to iowalearningfarms.org/webinars or the YouTube page. If you know somebody that you think might have interest, please let them know about this, that this will be archived. And I think that's the last of the logistical slides. And there was one, Kevin, if you could go back to the slide where you had the QR codes, and I think maybe it was for that video. We can put that one up as the questions come in. Okay. So one more back. There we go. Okay. So folks can get that. Okay. I think that maybe you know this one, but were all of these the samples that were analyzed and then summarized for this discrete samples?
Yes, for the spring sites, they were all discrete.
Okay.
Typically, we're sampled at least 2 times a year, once
Okay.
in June and then once in September.
Okay. How did you determine which wells were used in this study or relevant to the study?
Yeah, so really kind of comes down to the frequency of the number of data that we had for the well. So for trends, we had a minimum requirement of at least 6 samples over that time period, that trend period. For streams, it was a little bit higher because we have more variability with that data. So
Yeah.
we had a little bit tighter requirement on that. But for wells, it was mainly the frequency of the samples. The other thing that was a key factor was aquifer information. So we had to have enough information as far as the well construction and the well depth and how that well was installed, so we could discern, what aquifer that well was actually pulling water from.
Okay. And I'm assuming there was a wide variation in depth of wells that were tested.
Yes, the shallow wells, typically in those superficial aquifers, the depth of those wells are probably in the range of around about 120 feet up to about 200 feet. And then in those deeper settings, we're looking at wells that could range from, 200 to 400 would be a common range. And then we have, in those really deeper settings, we may have wells that would be up in that 500 to 600 range.
Okay. There was somebody that said as a producer, we thought soil chemistry would convert the nitrate and allichlor to other forms. I guess, how was this measured or impacting the results?
Yeah, great question. So one thing about allichlor, and that's kind of one of the key characteristics of using allichlor and the degradate of allichlor, which is the ethane sulfanic acid, is that once it does get into groundwater, it's considered to be conservative or stable. So there's no essentially chemical, physical, or biological processes that are going to affect it. As opposed to nitrate, we know that nitrate is could potentially denitrify because of bacterial processes. But with nitrate, you have to have kind of 2 things for denitrification. You have to have a carbon source and you have to have anoxic conditions. And what we typically see in these settings is that we don't think denitrification is a really big component in many of these aquifers, just because they tend to be pretty well aerated and we don't have that carbon source.
Okay. So we
But as we get into the area 3, that's where we do see area 3. If we do go deeper into some of those deeper aquifers, we do have anoxic conditions, but it's still unclear. I think there needs to be more research on that in terms of what effect denitrification is having. But But in terms of using allochlorid ESA as a tracer, that's what kind of makes it a kind of an ideal tracer, in that it does not change once it gets in the groundwater.
Okay. They're kind of somewhat related questions here that somebody said they would expect the stream loads of nitrate to go up during wet periods while the concentrations decrease. And I think you were looking at concentrations, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yep.
Yep.
So everything that I was showing you is just concentrated related, but you're right. If we have a lot of flow, we'll tend to have more load, pounds per acre. But concentrations, what we think is happening, again, when we have these back-to-back really wet years, we kind of strip away some of that residual nitrate from the profile of the soil, and then we start to get dilution. And potentially, especially in these poorly drained soils, right, we can get denitrification and other loss mechanisms.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. Some great questions that have come in. I guess maybe I missed this, but when you were looking at kind of the tile drained areas versus some of the non-tile drained areas, were the concentrations of nitrate higher in those streams in the tile drained areas?
Yeah, so if I go back, so our median concentration, well, I'll kind of show this first. So our median
Okay.
concentration from spring streams and wells in the driftless area ranged from, around 4 up to about 8. And I don't know if I have that listed
Okay.
on here. If I have that listed. I think I had it, but I could be wrong. I may not have included it. Yeah, I didn't. It doesn't look like I included it. I want to say that they were higher. They were
Okay.
slightly higher, but they were pretty comparable to, let's say, our area 2 of the Karst region, where you're probably coming in around that, around that 8 to 10, maybe even 12 milligram per liter, sort of flow away to mean concentrations, I guess. So.
Um, This is maybe one for the future, but are there any plans or opportunity to tease out the effects of conservation practice implementation in the past 10 to 20 years on those, springs, wells, or streams that are kind of above that black line on your conceptual figure?
Yes, that is something that, some of my colleagues are working on right now, and it really kind of boils down to, kind of fine tuning these models to estimate that. And, how do we disentangle, the effects of weather, versus what the practices are. But one of the challenges that we have is, we have this really high resolution water quality data, but we don't have the high resolution farm practice information. And so that's something that, we continue to struggle with. And we do know that, there's been a lot of improvements in practices, especially over the last, 10, 20 years, especially the use of, better, higher nitrogen use efficiency, types of corn hybrids, and, nitrogen stabilizers and those things. But unfortunately, we don't have very good, records of that, at kind of smaller scales. But we are also looking at kind of these kind of Vadostone networks of monitoring stations where we do have more of that detailed cropping information and farm practice information, and kind of linking that up with the data in that upper 4 feet of the soil profile.
Okay. Somebody asked, within the aquifers in the Karst region, is there more vertical or lateral movement of that water?
Yeah, probably be best, instead of me arm waving here, go back to this figure. So I would say, you said that, I'm sorry, repeat that. That was the superficial aquifer, the uppermost one?
Let me see here. Sorry. Now I lost it. Oh, shoot. Uh, Within I guess the aquifers in the karst area in general, is there more vertical or lateral movement of that water?
Kind of both, right? So we can have these really quick connections vertically, downward. But once we hit these confining layers, if you happen to be in an area where we have a confining layer on aquitard, like in this case, the Decorah Cummingsville Shale, that water tends to move horizontally. And then that water will try to make its way, kind of following the path of least resistance. And, usually, again, shows up, in a nearby stream, or may come back into the stream as kind of return flow back to that stream. So So yeah, it's basically a combination of both in those systems.
Okay. I think you kind of talked about this in a couple of the graphs showing flow pathways, but what do you see as the interaction between the groups of water? Are pollutants being stored and slowly released to uh, greater depths? Can we, I guess, can we clean up surface water and expect less pollutants to depth over time?
Yeah, so I kind of would probably reference this here to maybe help explain that a little bit. So in this example, this was Alachlor ESA. We stopped using this, let's say, again, about 25 years ago. So this kind of just shows, essentially, think of this like a wave, right? Like it's moving from left to right here. And so this wave of concentration is going to continue to move to the right. And so you can kind of use that same analogy if you would somehow, let's say, wave a magical wand and remove nitrate from the system. We would expect to see a similar sort of pattern where, yes, we're going to find the reductions show up much quicker in these shallow systems, but it's going to take decades for us to see that in these deeper systems.
Yeah. Do you think variability in land use, such as percent forest or wetland, can explain some of the variability in the nitrate not explained by depth or zone?
Um, I think partly it can, but like I mentioned before, we do have instances where, kind of going back to this one up here, we have instances where we have essentially the same percent land use, right? So in this case, 57%, all these have 57% land use of row cropping, but yeah, we have these markedly different nitrate concentrations of between 5 to 15. So I think, partly it can, but also, again, probably it's coming up with around half of this explanation. And then I think a significant amount is, again, this complicating factor of multiple flow paths of both older and younger water kind of mixing, and that's kind of the other key factor here. And I'm sure there's plenty of others that are beyond the
Yeah.
scope of what we looked at, but certainly groundwater age is one of those components that
Yep.
we really focused in on.
Yep. Have you or others considered doing a similar analysis with chloride concentrations?
Yeah, great question. So what's great about chloride, it's similar to unlike, well, it acts like nitrate, right? So it's a negatively charged, right? So it acts, once it's in the water, it moves with the water. And what's kind of an advantage of chloride is that it's conservative. It doesn't have these biological transformations that can happen. So chloride is a kind of a good tracer as well, because naturally in these systems we wouldn't find much chloride in them. Naturally, there's always going to be a little bit of background, but the primary source of chloride in these systems is either A, road salt, B, from our fertilizers that we put on, right? Our potassium chloride. And so that can be kind of an indicator of kind of the relative age or kind of what's going on here too. And we have used it in some ways kind of in the background, not necessarily explicitly in this study, but in the background, we use it as kind of like a check for us to see if things kind of make sense or not.
Okay. Um, here's a here's a good one. What is your certainty about the drainage area to the springs?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So in let's say, let's go back to this one here. Well, if we look at the superficial aquifers, so if we're, let's say, in these superficial aquifers in this, let's say this area 1 here or area 2, we feel pretty good about that. Our partner, sister agency, Department of Natural Resources, one of the key tools that we use is dye tracing, and we basically put that in sinkholes. We usually use a pump like a fire truck and put water in the sinkhole. When we place these packets filled with carbon, we analyze those and we determine basically with the flow path of where that water is moving. And in these superficial aquifers, it works very well to determine that. Now, there is a little bit of uncertainty when you do that dye tracing during a dry year versus a wet year, because you can have obviously different water table levels that can influence where that dye is going to go. I would say where we get more uncertainty as we get into, I would say this area 3, what we call the Prairie du Chien Plateau. That area is a bit more challenging to actually do sinkhole dye tracing. And so we have to kind of rely on potentiometric maps that show the elevations of the groundwater tables and kind of infer from that where we think that those groundwater divides are located. So yeah, that's kind of the kind of short to that.
All right. Kevin, I think in the interest of time and keeping it to a little under an hour, we'll end there. That is, thank you very much. There are many positive comments in the chat box. Really interesting and definitely something for all of us to think about as we're working on implementing conservation practices that we kind of need to be evaluating some of our progress using a variety of metrics, because if we just rely on the water, it could be some period of time until we see some changes. Um, with that, I will give you any last word that you want, Kevin. But again, thanks everybody for attending. Please tune in next week. There, Kevin, all last word is yours.
Yeah, thank you all. And again, hats off to the ILF team for putting these webinars together. So appreciate it.
All right.